Hello, my name is Michael Butler, and today I am presenting black tea classification in Britain from Eastern tradition to Western standardization. So, to introduce this topic, I want to talk about the early classification and a history of black tea. We'll focus on the Chinese origins, move on to how black tea got started, and then follow with this European fascination and how that has influenced taxonomy and commerce and classification systems. After which we'll talk about how this dual classification has shaped the modern tea industry. So Chinese origins of tea classification starts with Lu Yu's The Classic of Tea. So before, tea has a very rich history going back 5,000 years, but I think this is a great example of how classification was very widely used and very systematic. Classified tea using region, leaf shape, processing techniques, what water to use. It was a very comprehensive and thorough guide to tea. There was actually no mention of black tea because it hadn't been invented yet. In fact, it was invented in 1568 in Wuyi Mountain, in Tongli village. The first tea was in fact Lapsang Souchong. They're a very famous tea. I think we all quite know Lapsang Souchong. So the story, there's many different stories for this, but the story that I like to say is it was created accidentally when soldiers came through. They ruined the leaves, some slept in the leaves or trampled the leaves, and rather than throw them away, the workers wanted to use what they had and they wanted to sell it anyway. So they decided to pine smoke it, and while it was rejected locally, they eventually managed to sell it, and they sold it to early Portuguese and Dutch traders who introduced tea into Europe in the 1500s. In fact, it went so well that they came back the next year and bought even more. So Britain actually embraced tea in 1657, and while it was dotted here and there, the first official sale is known as Thomas Garway's Coffee House, but the whole movement didn't really take off until it was catalyzed by Queen Catherine of Braganza in 1662 when she married Charles II. So Princess Catherine and the Portuguese in general had a great love for tea, and this transferred over to the aristocratic society and the royal courts. Rather than trading with the Dutch, who had the monopoly at the time, the British wanted to trade directly with China. So just to pause history for a second, we're going to talk about this early British categorization. So categorization in the UK for tea was split into three main categories. We had Bohea, which was a black tea. It's actually an Anglicization of the word Wuyi, so Wuyi Mountains. We then also have Singlo and Bing. So both of these other ones are green teas, so we're going to focus mainly on Bohea. So Bohea actually was not necessarily a Hongcha, but just a semi-oxidized tea. I think back in those days, especially when this is some years after black tea took off and was invented. So, but still the industry was very, very young. This classification was obviously based on appearance and flavor rather than the processing method. And so already we have an issue with Europeans calling it black tea when the Chinese and the manufacturers would call it red tea. By 1797, there were 8 types of tea listed in Encyclopedia Britannica. So 100 years later, we've got so many more categories. The industry has very much evolved, and we're buying more and more stuff. So for black teas, we have Souchong, Kongu, and Pekoe. So I'm not quite sure if Souchong is a reference to Lapsang Souchong, or Souchong has just become a branched categorization term. Kongu is an Anglicization of the word Gongfu, and Pekoe is a reference to flowers, flowery nature. Pekoe actually evolved into meaning more bud content. And actually, Bohea, which was one of the original three categories, actually has become a kind of umbrella term for actually poor quality tea. So what was kind of the standard and top tea became one of the lowest, kind of maybe because it was a bit more unclassified when it came to, is it fully oxidized, is it semi-oxidized, but it was just, as I said, an umbrella term for, say, dark teas, black teas. So moving on in history, we have the rise of Indian tea and CTC processing. So the British wanted to grow their own tea, and they tried very hard all over the world, lots of former colonies, and it all failed. They were, however, successful in Assam and Darjeeling. So in Darjeeling especially, they managed to grow Chinese tea. And while they failed to grow, to propagate and grow, say, cultivate Chinese tea leaves in Assam because it was a bit too hot, they did discover some native tea trees that grew in the kind of Himalayan foothills in Assam, and they cultivated them instead, and proved very successful. By the 1930s, we have CTC processing, which means crush, tear, and cut, and this is a kind of conveyor belt processing system. This revolutionized tea in terms of production and yield, and with that yield, we have industrial grading and we have picking season. So it very much moved from kind of Kongu, Souchong, all these kind of references in commercial trade, straight into kind of this kind of fully industrial classification. So now we have orange pekoe, flowery orange pekoe, golden flowery orange pekoe. These are references to actually bud content within the leaf. We have both full leaf categorization and classification, and we also have broken leaf as well, because of the cutting and the sorting of machines. At this moment in time, we have a dual classification system. So in the West, we have commercial, it's all about commercial utility, size and grade, such as orange pekoe, and this is mainly found in former colonized tea regions, such as Sri Lanka, India, and Africa. In the East, the system is more about origin, harvest time, and cultural practice. We also have some additions in numerical or name grades, but possibly these are to kind of meet the West in needs in terms of classification and selling to the West. So the legacy of standardization comes in one form, which is the ISO, which stands for the International Organization of Standardization, which release a contemporary classification of tea terms every year, which are put into kind of some repute. We do have critics like Professor Chen Chuan, who give insights to some issues with the Western standardization system. There's a risk of erasing cultural context. Recently, a kind of controversial point, kind of terminology that they started to use in the ISO was aeration rather than oxidation. I think it's still mixed, but while there's kind of two sides to this argument, I believe that tea has never been closer, it's never been more unified in terms of classification. So we do use the color coding system for tea, which actually was created by Chen Chuan. There's a focus on the revival of single estate teas, we have terroir, we have artisanal methods, and a real kind of understanding and look at origin, where things come from, how they're made. So in conclusion, I want to say how tea classification reflects more than just trade. It mirrors cultural values and power structures within society. From Liu Yu to CTC processing, industrial grading, modern standardization, it's a story of globalization, identity, and how adaptation has shaped the tea industry and the people, the world.